So today's topic on discovering meaning is pain versus suffering and understanding the difference. So this is something anyone that's gone through chronic illness can definitely attest to, having both of these experiences. And so just as an outline, so we're on the same page of the definition of what we're talking about, is the cause of pain. So pain is that physical sensation caused by injury or illness. So this is like that visceral feeling in the body of this acute sensations. And then the suffering is the emotional and mental response to pain, which we'll kind of get more into. And so chronic pain can lead to long-term suffering. So they kind of go hand in hand. And as anyone who's lived with chronic pain or chronic illness, and is this mental health piece really comes into play as well. So they feed each other. Pain feeds suffering, and suffering then feeds pain. And so when we talk about the cause of suffering, so because pain is the physical sensation that we experience when something hurts or harms our body, the suffering is the emotional or mental response to the pain. And that can be caused by various factors, such as fear of the future, of what's going to happen if we're going to continue being in this state, things, not going well in our bodies, and the anxiety of the experience. And then, of course, that perpetuates stress, and then therefore feeds a cycle back into this experience of pain, inflammation, just being totally uncomfortable in the body. So suffering is 100% caused by our own thoughts and beliefs about the pain, and which is an interesting thing to think about, because sometimes it's like, oh, well, you can't help but have these thoughts and beliefs when you're in this constant pain state, which is perfectly acceptable way to look at it. And then, so that will amplify the emotional response and then make it worse. So today we're going to really deep dive some different perspectives on suffering and what that means from different teachers and spiritual beliefs, and then talk about what can we do about it, because really the pain in the body is definitely something that we don't want, we don't feel good about, but it's the suffering that's the real concern. It's the suffering that goes on with the mental anguish that goes on in this constant looping of these thought patterns when we are going through something like this. And rightfully so. If it's one of those things, easier said than done. It's like simple. Don't think about it. Huh, okay. It's like easier said than done in reducing our suffering and bringing ourselves to a state of a peaceful mindset when your body is going through these just almost insane things of this inflammation and pain and all the different types of things that come along with a chronic illness. So suffering when living with chronic illness, kind of just touched on this, but we'll get deeper into it. So as we kind of touched on here, the pain is that physical sensation, and when something's going on in the body, and then that chronic pain, because it's constantly going on, it can lead to long-term suffering and like this traumatization. You end up with like PTSD essentially, because you're just constantly being re-traumatized. And then that ends up feeding the chronic illness at the same time. And this is where we end up in this vicious cycle. So because the suffering is caused by our own thoughts and beliefs about the pain, it then releases those neurochemicals of like, we're in an emergency state and help. And so then that talks to your cells and says, we are in fight or flight, we are in survival mode. And then the cells degenerate our genes because they're putting all of their energy into survival. And then it ends up feeding the chronic illness even more. So hence we end up in this downward spiral of illness. And so this is where we really have to, as if it is our main priority and main job, to intercept that piece, the mental piece. And we'll get into more of the how right away here. And so this is Byron Katie, amazing spiritual teacher. If you haven't heard of her before, she is just so interesting. So I look at her as like, she's totally different than Eckhart Tolle, but she's like a female Eckhart Tolle in how they came into their spiritual awakening. She had a sudden spiritual awakening, which is rare. Normally with evolution of consciousness, you kind of notch up as you go and you learn these lessons and your consciousness evolved. She had like an instant evolution in her consciousness. So she was addicted to pain pills. She had an eating disorder. She was absolutely miserable and just in just a terrible state of being. She was an entrepreneurial person and was a go-getter, and she couldn't get along with anyone in her family. She was smoking all the time and just drinking all the time and just completely self-destructive. And so it got to the point where she was suffering so deeply that she ended up in this home, and they had to put her in a place for women with eating disorders because they couldn't figure out what to do with her. And they had to separate her from the other women because she was so miserable to be around. Like no one could even handle being around her. And what happened is one day she woke up on the floor because she didn't even feel like she deserved to sleep in the bed. So she slept on the floor because she didn't even feel she deserved the bed. Like that's how miserable she was. That's how in suffering she was. And as she opened her eyes, she said this split second, she could see the world being created before her eyes. And it was this split second in between where there was nothingness into everything coming into reality. And in that moment, she realized that she was in charge of her own experience. It was her. She was creating this with her mind. And she just snapped, all of a sudden enlightened. And she would walk around. She was so discombobulated because it was just all of a sudden she was enlightened. She could barely even speak for a while. It took her a while to integrate it all. And she would go around saying to people like, we are one, we are one. And she would just show up and walk around and talk, and people would come to her because she was called the lit lady for a long time because she was glowing. She was so enlightened. She literally was glowing. And I think you can see that in often like halos around people. It's like that's that enlightened state. And she was literally glowing, and people would just start coming to her because she was so enlightened that people were just magnetized and drawn into her. And she's been doing what she calls the work ever since. So highly recommend looking up Byron Katie, the work. And she says the cause of all suffering is what we are thinking and believing. It's our perception of the experience. So whether that's in relationships, like he did that, she did this, and so she has this technique called the work, and goes like this: judge your neighbor, write it down, ask 4 questions, and turn it around. As you can see, I've really studied her work and I really enjoy it. And you can go onto her website, and there's total free access to the work, she calls it. And it's all about questioning our beliefs, questioning our thoughts, discovering the reality behind them, and it causes relief of suffering. And this was a huge for me. So in 2017, I was introduced to her work, and it was out of desperation that I found her. It was New Year's Eve, and I couldn't go with my family to the party. I just said, go without me. I was in so much pain, like literally head to toe pain. Every joint, every muscle in my body was in excruciating pain. And like, I couldn't even do anything. All I could do was lie on the couch still. And so I started looking up YouTube, and somehow, I don't remember how, but came across Byron Katie. And it was like this click moment for me. And I just would watch her with people doing the work on all their different experiences of suffering. And it really was one of those pieces that was big for me in changing how I perceived life and how I perceived my experiences. And it got me through those deepest hours, or darkest hours of suffering, because I was deep into pain and suffering, so deep. It's like, I can remember it like it was yesterday, because it was just so extreme. And, when you go through an extreme circumstance, it gets etched into your memory forever. And Byron Katie was a huge factor in there. So highly recommend her. And so the Buddhist principles on suffering, and so the Buddha said, pain is certain. We'll definitely experience pain in life, being human, and suffering is optional. So Buddha believed that suffering is caused by desiring and craving. And this actually goes in line with Byron Katie as well. So she is all about falling in love with reality, because it is what it is. We are in reality. And until we sit in acceptance of exactly where we are right here, right now, there isn't a lot of moving forward, because you're stuck in this state of desiring and craving, which is a very low frequency state, because it's this feeling of lack that you are like not going to ever escape this experience. And so when you're stuck in that, it perpetuates in the mind and creates even more suffering. So he looked at suffering as this desiring and craving for things to be different than what they actually are. It's the denial of reality is what causes suffering. And then we have Jesus Christ. And so Christ's views on suffering. So this is where it gets really interesting with the Bible, because there is the Old Testament where there is a lot of God is a punisher, and there is a lot of spiritual belief systems around this, that whatever vibration, whatever frequency of consciousness you are on, you have a different perspective on what and who God is. And so Christ, in his Sermon on the Mount, he rejected that. He rejected the traditional view that God is vengeful and wants us to suffer. He was the one that came and said, no, God is love. God does not want you to suffer. This is something that is chosen by us in being human, that we have free will. That's the part of being human, is that it's essentially, from all the studies I've looked at, we live in purgatory. We can make a heaven out of it. We can make a hell out of it. And it can cascade by the decisions we make each step along the way. Like, each step can either take us into more of a loving, peaceful, benign state, or each step can take us further and further into despair, anger, guilt, apathy, shame. And so you can see that that's why, if you're sitting in guilt and shame and anger and fear, you would assume God did this to me and God wants me to suffer. And when you're sitting in this state of feeling complete and peaceful and loving, you would think, oh, God is love. God is pure love. And so that's why the perception changes. So you can see through the Bible, the evolution of consciousness and where people were in their state of consciousness during those times. And so in the New Testament, Christ came in at this very high enlightened state and was like, look, it's like the old way of thinking is out, and this is how it really is. So I found that really interesting, how Jesus describes what it means to suffer. And so how to manage pain and sufferings, because this is the thing, is we're in a catch-22 when it's feeding itself down into this state of constantly releasing those neurochemicals that then cause more pain in the body, more inflammation, more difficult experiences with that, and then for more suffering. And it's really removing ourselves from that cycle. So I talk about this all the time, and I created a therapy modality around this: awareness. So it's coming back to the present moment, back to that present moment, back to that present moment, in awareness of what it is you're experiencing, accepting reality, and also we'll get into some more therapy parts in a second here, but it's just, this is where it starts, coming back into alignment with reality. Okay, this is where I am. It does not mean that it's forever. And I'm going to come into a state of calming myself like it is my job. And I'm going to be aware that, yes, this is reality. And yes, I have the power to alter this reality by soothing my nervous system, soothing my thoughts, and just coming back to that. And sometimes when you're in severe pain, severe difficulties with your body's functioning, you might have to do that every 10 seconds. And that's how it is. And then it does over time, that will space out. And then it's like, oh, every minute it comes up and back into center, back into that awareness. And then, oh, it's coming up every 10 minutes. And then eventually it gets to the point where it's a part of your actual beingness. You don't even have to think about bringing yourself back into awareness, back into being centered. It's very rare where you wake up and you're like, oh, I was totally unconscious there for a minute. And so sometimes we can wake up and be like, oh, I was totally unconscious for like the last 3 weeks. That happens too. And so this is where self-compassion is a big piece too. The self-forgiveness and taking it easy on yourself. What you're going through is difficult, acknowledging that, and how powerful you are to be a person that has gone through this experience and continues to get up every day and live life. That is huge. The fact that you've done that just shows your power and what an amazing, vibrant soul you are. And so it's really that self-compassion, self-forgiveness. And when we look back at regrets and this cravingness for it to be different, it's coming into compassion. Like, it's okay, sweetheart. You know, we got ourselves here step by step. It's taking that responsibility and saying we're doing it different now. And sometimes you do have to talk to yourself in third person. I mean, we have arguments with ourselves all the time, so you might as well get involved in it and bring in that self-compassion piece. And then, so another thing is seeking that support, because sometimes that's just what we need. And yes, this is an internal process. It is, but sometimes you do need that outside support, for someone to cheerlead you and to buoy your energy and to help bring you back into a state of alignment so you can continue to move forward. Because that isolation piece, when you're going through that mental anguish, that suffering, that it compounds it so deeply. And it's one of those things, especially as women, we often don't say anything. We self-sacrifice and And it gets to the point where things are so severe, but when you finally say something, and you still might not say something. And often what happens with women is they do this isolation. They hold themselves back because it's like this feeling of not deserving. It's like, it really is about a feeling of self-worth. And I've been there, where I wouldn't even imagine asking for help because I didn't really feel like I deserved that. And so what happens is you end up completely isolated. You work through it yourself. It takes way longer, and you're going through this suffering alone. And then once you actually come through and conquer it, then you go tell people. Then you share your story after you're coming out the other side. And so this is where this can end up going on for a very long time, and it's just not necessary. And we live in a time now where we're starting to reconnect in community and realizing how important that is, and how it's important to learn how to receive, that we are meant to live in community. We are meant to lift each other up. Yes, there will be periods of life where you go into solitude, and that's okay. That's part of a evolution of consciousness, where you do have a period of time of solitude, but it's the suffering in that, it's the loneliness that it's not conducive to creating health and peace. So it's really important to reach out when you're going through the actual suffering piece to people you can trust. It's ensuring that it's people that you are going to receive support from, that care, and that aren't going to place judgment on you in your experience. Because sometimes you can just get, oh, well, just do this or just do that. That's not helpful. Because if you could just do this or just do that, you would. And so it's going to the people that you know that you can count on, that will hold space for you to be and to be able to express yourself. So that part is important as well, because otherwise then the suffering can be compounded when we try to engage with the people that do not have our well-being in mind. When they're not concerned about it, it ends up compounding our suffering. And so here is a big one, and I highly recommend this. 10 out of 10 recommend trying this out. So laughter is medicine. So it's really interesting what's going on here. So many women are addicted to true crime, stuff like that. Why is that? And so many women have survived several traumatic experiences. And what happens is it becomes addictive. So these true crimes actually make people feel at ease temporarily, because it's giving that space of normalcy, and it's releasing those chemicals that you get addicted to. It's literally like becomes like a drug. Like codependent relationships, abuse, like when you're in a relationship with someone that's narcissistic, it is like being on like heroin. It is so addictive. You get addicted to that emotional roller coaster until you're done with it. And so it's the same thing with watching these shows. It's that re-traumatization. It gives a sense of normalcy and releases those chemicals. And also it destroys the nervous system. So it really is what we are watching. The subconscious does not know the difference between what is actually happening and what's a show, or what we're listening to. The subconscious takes everything in. It doesn't question anything. It just takes it in. So when we are filling our minds with things like that, then it's reflected in so many areas of life, increases anxiety, increases depression, increases that internal suffering. So what we want to do is the opposite. Be cognizant of what is going into your mind. And I myself have not watched the news since I think 2006. And so that's a while. And the funniest thing is I've never needed to. There's so many things going on in our planet. And guess what? I hear all about the important things, all about it. It's like, so you don't miss anything. You don't need to go looking for what's going wrong. Someone will let you know what's important. It doesn't mean you just go into denial or you behave ignorantly about what's going on, but it's like, okay, there's the knowledge. I acknowledge that that's what's going on. And I also choose to not focus on that in my reality, because there's literally nothing I can do about it to control what's going on. I will just focus on what I can control. And so one thing that we can control is what we put into our minds. So laughter as a medicine, when they say laughter is the best medicine, it is true. And I get it. Sometimes we don't feel like laughing, but guess what? Even when we're fake laughing, it works. And there is a yoga technique where you just come and laugh. So even if you are forcing yourself to laugh, it works. Again, the subconscious has no idea whether that's real or not. So that mechanism of laughing causes the brain to release those health supporting chemicals. And so it releases chemicals like dopamine. Everyone loves some dopamine hit, and oxytocin and endorphins. And so those feel good hormones. And so what you want to do is watch the funniest shows you could possibly watch, like something that you just love. And maybe it's a sitcom, something that you can watch over and over again because you just love it, and get immersed into it, into just watching the funniest things you can possibly, uplifting things, positive things, start looking on YouTube for like people's experience in healing, people's experiences in like just miraculous things happening in their lives. And this will reprogram and restructure the subconscious to be bringing up these thoughts more naturally. So this way you're really helping yourself come to a place of ease, even when there's pain or discomfort going on in the body. It helps to ease the mind. And then when that happens, the nervous system is soothed. You flip into a parasympathetic nervous state, which is now telling the body, okay, it's now time to release and heal. And that's why often in our program in the beginning, there's a lot of crying going on, emotional release going on, because as the nervous system flips into that state, now the body goes, okay, now it's safe to release these stored neuropeptides that are attached to the cells, clears the cells, helps clear the cells, and then the cells create more robust DNA and healthy DNA, and therefore healing is the side effect. And so laughter is a big piece and not to be underestimated in its power. So bottom line, pain is inevitable. It is. And unfortunately for some people, the chronic pain it's one of those things where you have to go so deep into then relieving yourself of the suffering that goes along with it. And so as Buddha says, pain is inevitable and suffering is optional. So although it's difficult, we can choose to let go and find peace by constantly coming back into our centeredness and really being aware of reality, and also aware that we have the power to alter it.